When Lee J. Cobb finally testified against his friends in Hollywood, he wasn't doing it because he hated communists. He was broke. His wife was locked in a mental institution. The government had taken his passport. He couldn't feed his kids. But that's not even the most shocking part. The truth is, the famous actor was never even political. He was blacklisted, tortured, and broken for a crime he didn't commit. This is the story they don't want you to know. Lee J. Cobb was born Leo Jacoby on December 8, 1911, in New York City's Lower East Side. His parents were Jewish immigrants. His father, Benjamin Jacob, came from Russia. His mother, Kate Neelect Jacob, was from Romania. The Lower East Side was packed with families trying to build a future. It was loud, crowded, and full of ambition. His father worked as a compositor for the Jewish Daily Forward, a Yiddish newspaper that helped immigrants stay connected to their roots. Cobb's early years were shaped by struggle and hard work. He grew up watching his parents push through challenges, something that stayed with him. Later, when he acted, that same toughness came through in his performances. His birth name reflected his heritage, but when he stepped into the entertainment world, he changed it. Many Jewish actors did the same, hoping to avoid the discrimination that was common in Hollywood. As a child, Cobb's family moved to the Bronx, settling near Crotona Park on Wilkins Avenue. The Bronx was changing fast. Immigrants from all over the world filled its neighborhoods. Crotona Park was one of the few places where families could escape the crowded streets. His father's job provided steady income, but it was more than just work. The Jewish Daily Forward was a connection to their culture and a voice for people trying to find their way in America. Cobb grew up surrounded by these stories, and they shaped the way he later approached acting. At first, it looked like music might be his future. Cobb was a violin prodigy, with an incredible ear for sound. He could also play the harmonica. He had real talent, but everything changed when he was a teenager. He broke his wrist, and just like that, his dreams of being a violinist were over. It was a devastating moment, but it forced him to look for something else. That search led him to acting. At 17, he made a bold move. He ran away to Los Angeles, determined to make it in Hollywood. The film industry was growing fast, and thousands of hopefuls were chasing the same dream. Cobb joined a musical group called Bora Minovich's Harmonica Rascals. But acting jobs were nearly impossible to find. After a few years of struggle, he had no choice but to return to New York. He was disappointed but not ready to give up. Back home, he took accounting classes at New York University, while working in radio dramas during the day. He needed a backup plan, but acting was still his real passion. In 1935, Lee J. Cobb took a step that would change his life. He joined the Group Theater, a company that was reshaping American drama. This ensemble, founded in 1931 by Harold Clurman, Cheryl Crawford, and Lee Strasberg, rejected flashy entertainment and focused on real, hard-hitting stories about ordinary people. It was the heart of socially conscious theater, and Cobb became part of it when it was at its peak. He worked alongside actors like Elia Kazan, Stella Adler, and John Garfield, who would later become some of the biggest names in theater and film. The group theater wasn't just about acting, it was a movement. The members believed in using drama to highlight real social struggles, especially those of the working class. They didn't chase individual fame, but focused on collaboration. This approach shaped Cobb's acting philosophy. It also introduced him to method acting, a technique inspired by Konstantin Stanislavski. This method pushed actors to tap into personal emotions and experiences, making performances feel deeply real. His work with the group theater quickly led to major performances. In 1935, he took part in Waiting for Lefty, a play by Clifford Odets that became a sensation. It told the story of a taxi driver's strike and broke traditional theater rules by making the audience feel like part of the protest. When it premiered on January 6, 1935, at the Civic Repertory Theater, the crowd erupted in applause. The cast received 28 curtain calls that night, a rare achievement. Cobb had a voice role, but even that was enough to make him part of something historic. The play later moved to Broadway's Longacre Theater, where it continued to draw passionate audiences. 2 years later, Cobb played Mr. Carp in Golden Boy, another Odette's play that tackled ambition, identity, and moral struggles. It debuted in 1937 and told the story of Joe Bonaparte, a violinist torn between his love of music and the lure of fame as a boxer. Cobb performed alongside Elia Kazan and John Garfield in a production directed by Harold Clurman. Golden Boy connected with audiences dealing with America's slow recovery from the Great Depression. Cobb's performance stood out for its emotional depth, proving he could bring complexity to any role. That same year, Cobb made his Broadway debut in Crime and Punishment. The play, based on Fyodor Dostoevsky's novel, opened on January 22, 1935, at the Biltmore Theater. He played Coke, a saloon keeper, in a production that tried to bring the novel's psychological depth to the stage. But despite its ambition, it closed after just 15 performances on February 6, 1935. It was a short run, but for Cobb, it was an important step. At only 24, he was already building a reputation as an actor willing to take on difficult material. Lee J. Cobb's journey in Hollywood started in 1934 with a small role in The Vanishing Shadow, a science fiction serial from Universal. The film introduced early sci-fi gadgets, including what many believe was the first handheld ray gun in cinema. For Cobb, it was a modest beginning, but it marked the start of a career that would last more than 40 years. By 1937, he was working under the name Lee Colt and taking roles in low-budget westerns. One of these was Rustler's Valley, released by Paramount Pictures on July 23, 1937. He played Cal Howard, a supporting role alongside William Boyd, better known as Hopalong Cassidy, and George Gabby Hayes. Westerns were Hollywood's go-to for simple action-packed stories, and Cobb was trying to make a name for himself in this world. He also appeared in North of the Rio Grande the same year, but these roles didn't turn him into a star. The name Lee Colt was an attempt to fit the rugged cowboy image, but Cobb didn't stick with it for long. He wanted to be recognized as a serious actor, not just another face in B-movie westerns. Dropping the stage name was his way of moving toward something bigger. That decision set him on the path that would define his career. His real breakthrough came in 1939, when he returned to Hollywood after success on Broadway. He was cast in Golden Boy, an adaptation of Clifford Odets's play. The film starred William Holden as Joe Bonaparte, a young violinist torn between music and boxing. Cobb played his father, Mr. Bonaparte, a role that required him to convincingly portray an older man, despite being just 7 years older than Holden. This role changed everything. His performance as the caring yet conflicted father gave the film emotional weight. Golden Boy became a hit, cementing William Holden as a rising star, while proving that Cobb could bring depth to a supporting role. His background with the group theater had shaped his acting style, and now Hollywood was taking notice. More serious roles followed, and his days of minor parts in westerns were behind him. During the 1940s, Cobb's ability to take on different kinds of roles became clear. He appeared in The Song of Bernadette in 1943, playing Dr. Dozus, a skeptical physician who slowly comes to believe in young Bernadette Soubirous' visions. The film, based on Franz Werfel's novel, was a major success. It won 4 Academy Awards at the 16th Oscars, and Cobb's performance added depth to a story built around faith and doubt. 3 years later, he played Kralahome, the Prime Minister of Siam, in Anna and the King of Siam, 1946. The film explored the culture clash between Anna Owens, played by Irene Dunne, and King Mongkut, played by Rex Harrison. Cobb's performance stood out for its quiet authority, showing a character who was both powerful and deeply aware of the shifting world around him. The film won 2 Academy Awards for Best Cinematography and Best Art Direction, and was later adapted into the famous musical The King and I. Lee J. Cobb became a legend on February 10, 1949. That night, Death of a Salesman premiered at the Morosco Theater in New York City. Cobb played Willie Loman, a struggling salesman drowning in failure. Under Elia Kazan's direction, he didn't just act, he became the character. Audiences sat in stunned silence as they watched a man unravel before their eyes. The play was an instant success. Cobb's performance was raw and heartbreaking. Every night, he brought the same desperation and intensity. People left the theater shaken. Critics called it one of the greatest performances in Broadway history. He earned a Tony Award nomination, and his Willie Loman became the standard for every actor who played the role after him. Arthur Miller, who wrote the play, was amazed. Cobb's performance changed how he saw his own character. He even rewrote parts of the script to match Cobb's strength and emotional depth. He later called him the greatest dramatic actor I ever saw. Their collaboration turned Death of a Salesman into one of the most powerful plays ever written. The Broadway run lasted 742 performances, from February 10, 1949 to November 18, 1950. Night after night, Cobb delivered with the same intensity. Most actors would have burned out, but he never did. The play won the Pulitzer Prize for Drama and multiple Tony Awards. Its success proved that serious theater could be both powerful and profitable. Cobb's influence didn't end when the show closed. In 1966, he reprised the role for a television adaptation, making sure his legendary performance was preserved. Even decades later, his Willie Loman remains the one that all others are measured against. Lee J. Cobb built a career playing strong, commanding figures on screen. But behind the scenes, his life took a much different turn. In the 1930s, he joined the Group Theater in New York, a collective that focused on socially conscious plays. Many of its members leaned left politically, drawn to Marxist ideas or other progressive causes. Cobb wasn't deeply involved in politics, but like many artists of that era, he believed in using theater to address social issues. At the time, that wasn't unusual. The Great Depression had left millions struggling, and many intellectuals saw capitalism as a broken system. But in the 1940s and 50s, when fear of communism spread across the country, those past associations became dangerous. The Red Scare reached Hollywood with full force. Senator Joseph McCarthy and the House Un-American Activities Committee, known as HUAC, launched investigations to root out suspected communists. Cobb's name came up because of his past with the Group Theater and friendships with left-leaning artists like Clifford Odets and John Garfield. In 1951, actor Larry Parks testified before HUAC and named Cobb as someone with communist ties. That was all it took. HUAC didn't need evidence of actual communist activity. Just an accusation was enough to make someone a target. Arthur Miller, who worked with Cobb on Death of a Salesman, later said Cobb was never truly political. Like many in the 1930s, he had sympathized with anti-Nazi and pro-Soviet movements, but that was common in a time when the Soviet Union was seen as a key ally against Hitler. Still, once HUAC labeled someone as suspicious, those details didn't matter. Cobb was under scrutiny, and his career was in danger. Things got worse in 1951 When Cobb was officially summoned to testify before HUAC, he refused. He would not name names or cooperate. That decision cost him everything. Hollywood blacklisted him, making it nearly impossible to find work in film or television. His passport was confiscated, cutting off any chance of working overseas. He was drowning in debt, struggling to provide for his family. Friends and colleagues kept their distance, afraid of being associated with him. It was a lonely and desperate time. For 2 years, Cobb held out, refusing to testify. But by 1953, he was at his breaking point. His wife had been institutionalized, and his financial troubles were overwhelming. He felt trapped. That year, he finally agreed to appear before HUAC. Under pressure, he named 20 people as former members of the Communist Party, though most were already known to the committee. Years later, he spoke openly about that choice. "The facilities of the government can be terrifying," he said. "I had no money. I couldn't borrow. I had the expenses of taking care of my children." The testimony allowed him to work again, but it came at a heavy cost. Many in Hollywood saw cooperation with HUAC as an unforgivable betrayal. Arthur Miller later called Cobb more a pathetic victim than a villain. Cobb had not named names to make a political statement. He had done it to survive. But the guilt followed him for the rest of his life. Ironically, just a year later, Cobb starred in On the Waterfront, 1954, a film that many believe defended those who testified before HUAC. It was directed by Elia Kazan and written by Bud Schulberg, both of whom had also named names. The film told the story of a dock worker, played by Marlon Brando, who testifies against corrupt union bosses. Cobb played Johnny Friendly, the corrupt boss himself. The film won 8 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. It was widely praised, but its political message sparked debate. Many saw it as Kazan's way of justifying his own testimony before HUAC. Cobb's role in On the Waterfront made his situation even more complicated. He had testified under pressure, then starred in a film that seemed to argue testifying was the right thing to do. He regretted what he had done, but the damage was already done. His friendships, his reputation, and the careers of those he named all suffered. 3 years later, in 1957, Cobb took on another unforgettable role in 12 Angry Men. He played juror number 3, the most aggressive and stubborn man in the room. The film was about jury deliberations in a murder trial, and Cobb's character was the strongest opponent to Henry Fonda's calm and rational juror number 8. Juror number 3 was loud and intimidating, always pushing his opinion on others. But beneath his anger was something deeper. His hostility came from personal pain, especially his broken relationship with his estranged son. The film built up to a powerful moment. As the debate continued, juror number 3's tough exterior started to crack. His emotions took over, and by the end, he broke down completely. He realized that his personal anger had clouded his judgment all along. It was one of the most powerful scenes in the film. Cobb was never nominated for an Oscar for this role, but many critics now see it as one of his finest performances. 12 Angry Men grew in reputation over time and is now considered one of the greatest films ever made. Cobb's performance played a major role in its lasting impact. His second Academy Award nomination came in 1958 for The Brothers Karamazov. He played Fyodor Karamazov, the manipulative and hedonistic father of a dysfunctional Russian family. Fyodor was a man driven by selfishness and greed, but Cobb gave him depth. He was not just a corrupt old man. He was also a symbol of moral decay, a person whose actions set off a chain of tragic events. The film explored themes of faith and morality, with Cobb at the center of it all. His performance was widely praised, and the National Board of Review named The Brothers Karamazov one of the top 10 films of 1958. Over time, opinions on the film became more divided, but Cobb's performance remained one of its most celebrated aspects. Cobb's talent wasn't limited to heavy drama. He proved he could handle a wide range of roles. In 1960, he starred in Exodus as Barak ben Canaan, a Zionist leader fighting for Israel's independence. His commanding presence made the role even more powerful. In How the West Was Won in 1962, he played Marshal Lou Ramsey in a sprawling Western epic. Then, in 1966, he surprised audiences with his comedic skills in Our Man Flint. He played Cramden, an exasperated intelligence chief in this James Bond parody. The film was both a commercial and critical success, proving that Cobb could shine even in lighter roles. Lee J. Cobb had a way of making every role feel larger than life. Whether on television, in film, or on stage, he brought a raw intensity that set him apart. His deep voice, commanding presence, and ability to show both strength and vulnerability made him one of the most respected actors of his time. From westerns to horror films to Shakespearean tragedies, Cobb could do it all. In 1962, he stepped into the role of Judge Henry Garth on The Virginian, a groundbreaking Western series on NBC. It was the first Western to run as a 90-minute drama, giving it more room for complex storytelling. Set in 1890s Wyoming, the show focused on life at Shiloh Ranch, and Cobb's character was at the heart of it. Garth wasn't just the ranch owner. He was a father figure, a mentor, and a man whose decisions carried real weight. Cobb played him with a mix of toughness and warmth. His adopted daughter Betsy, played by Roberta Shore, saw him as a strict but loving father. The ranch hands, including the Virginian himself, looked up to him as a leader. He wasn't just there to give orders. He settled disputes, made tough calls, and carried the burden of responsibility. In the episode The Judgment, Garth faces threats from a convicted man's family and reflects on his early days as a judge in Medicine Bow. Cobb's performance showed a man who wasn't just strong but also deeply human. He brought emotion to the role in a way that made Garth feel real. His time on The Virginian marked the show's peak years. Fans loved his presence, and his performances stood out. In It Tolls for Thee, he played one of his most intense moments. Garth is kidnapped and tortured by a vengeful ex-convict played by Lee Marvin. The episode pushed Cobb to his limits, and he delivered. His ability to show both pain and resilience made it one of the most memorable episodes of the series. In 1966, Cobb left the show. His character was written off in a way that felt fitting. Judge Garth left Shiloh Ranch to become the governor of Wyoming. His departure changed the series. Without him, The Virginian lost something important. His presence had grounded the show, giving it a depth that most Westerns didn't have. After leaving television, Cobb took on one of his most famous film roles. In 1973, he played Lieutenant William Kinderman in The Exorcist. The film became a worldwide phenomenon, earning 10 Academy Award nominations and grossing over $441 million. It was terrifying, intense, and filled with supernatural horror. But Cobb's performance as Kinderman gave the film something real. Kinderman wasn't caught up in the fear and hysteria surrounding Reagan McNeil's possession. He was a detective, trying to make sense of the impossible. When film director Burke Dennings is found dead at the bottom of a staircase, his head twisted completely backward, Kinderman investigates. Cobb played him as a man grounded in logic, but still unsettled by what he saw. Behind the scenes, The Exorcist was just as intense as what played out on screen. Director William Friedkin pushed his actors to the limit, sometimes using extreme methods to get reactions. He even fired guns on set without warning. The film's special effects were ahead of their time. The eerie sound of Reagan's head spinning 360 degrees was made by twisting a cracked leather wallet against a microphone. But amid all the technical achievements, Cobb's performance stood out. He made the horror feel believable. The Exorcist was one of his last major roles before his death in 1976. The film became legendary, inspiring sequels, prequels, and endless imitations. Cobb's portrayal of Kinderman remains one of the most grounded performances in the film. He wasn't just reacting to the horror, he was bringing a sense of realism to it. In the early 1970s, Cobb also took an unexpected turn in his career. He appeared in Italian crime thrillers known as poliziotteschi. These films were dark, violent, and reflected the political unrest of the time. American actors often took roles in European films during this period, and Cobb found a place in the genre. His most notable role came in Cross Shot, 1976, where he played a mafia boss caught in a deadly power struggle. These films had a style similar to American noir, but with more intensity. Explosive car chases, brutal shootouts, and corruption ran through every scene. Cobb fit the role perfectly. Even in an ensemble cast, he stood out. Cross Shot was released after his death, making it his final film. It wasn't as widely recognized as his Hollywood work, but it showed his willingness to keep pushing himself creatively. Even in his last years, he was taking on new challenges, proving he could dominate any genre. Beyond film and television, Cobb had another passion: live theater. In 1968, he took on one of the most demanding roles in Shakespeare's King Lear. It became the longest-running King Lear on Broadway at the time, with 72 performances. At age 56, Cobb played the aging king with a mix of power and heartbreak. His performance was raw, intense, and deeply emotional. King Lear is one of Shakespeare's most difficult plays. It's dark, complex, and requires an actor to give everything. Cobb delivered. He made Lear feel real, portraying a man losing his grip on everything he once controlled. The late 1960s were a time of political and social upheaval, and audiences connected with the play's themes of power and betrayal. Staging King Lear on Broadway had always been rare. Before Cobb's performance, the last major production was Orson Welles's in 1956. The next wouldn't come until Christopher Plummer took on the role in 2004. That alone speaks to the significance of Cobb's achievement. Lee J. Cobb's life was a mix of triumph and hardship. In 1940, he married Helen Beverly, a Yiddish theater and film actress. They had 2 children, including Julie Cobb, who later became an actress. But their marriage was tested by events far beyond their control. During the McCarthy era, Cobb was accused of being a communist. In 1951, he was blacklisted after being named in testimony before the House Un-American Activities Committee. Fear and suspicion surrounded him, and the pressure became unbearable. By 1952, the strain had broken their marriage. The political persecution nearly destroyed his personal life. Cobb later admitted that Helen suffered terribly during this time. The stress of the investigations led to her being institutionalized. Meanwhile, he felt trapped. The relentless pressure from the government left him emotionally and financially drained. In 1953, he testified before HUAC and named 20 individuals as former Communist Party members. He later justified his decision as an act of survival, one he deeply regretted but believed was necessary for his family. In 1957, Cobb married Mary Hirsch, a schoolteacher. This marriage gave him the stability he had lost. They had 2 children, bringing his total to 4. Despite the damage the Red Scare had done to his career and personal life, he found some peace with Mary. but years of stress and struggle had taken their toll. On February 11, 1976, Cobb died of a heart attack at the age of 64 in Woodland Hills, California. He was buried at Mount Sinai Memorial Park Cemetery in Los Angeles, where many notable figures from the Jewish community were laid to rest. His career had been filled with challenges, but his contributions to theater and film were undeniable. In 1981, he was posthumously inducted into the American Theater Hall of Fame. His performance as Willie Loman in Death of a Salesman remains one of the most powerful in Broadway history. His legacy still lives on,